Welcome back to our World War II series. I'm your host, and today we explore the tide turns, the crucial period when the momentum of history's greatest conflict shifted decisively against the Axis powers. When we last left our story, the world had witnessed Pearl Harbor's infamy, the Holocaust's unimaginable horror, and the transformation of entire societies for total war. By late 1943, 3 years of brutal combat had pushed human endurance to its limits. But now, the industrial might of the Allies was beginning to tell. And 2 critical battles would mark the beginning of the end for Hitler's dream of empire. From the frozen ruins of Stalingrad to the scorching sands of North Africa, from the mountains of Italy to the beaches of Normandy, we'll witness how the Axis powers, once seemingly invincible, began their long retreat toward ultimate defeat. Stalingrad and El Alamein, Axis on the retreat. The summer of 1942 had seen German forces reach their furthest expansion. In the east, Wehrmacht units approached the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. In North Africa, Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps stood just 60 miles from Alexandria, threatening the Suez Canal and Britain's lifeline to India. But these would prove to be high watermarks, not stepping stones to victory. Adolf Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad, named after his greatest enemy, Joseph Stalin, would cost Germany its finest army. What began as a strategic objective became a matter of personal prestige that consumed German resources like a black hole. General Friedrich Paulus commanded the German Sixth Army, arguably the Wehrmacht's most experienced formation. In August 1942, his forces entered Stalingrad's outskirts, beginning a battle that would rage for 6 months and claim over 2 million casualties. Urban warfare favored the defenders. Soviet soldiers, fighting for their homeland's survival, contested every building, every room, every staircase. The 62nd Army, commanded by General Vasily Chuikov, adopted the motto, "Every German must be made to feel he is living under the muzzle of a Russian gun." Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and his men held a single apartment building for 58 days, beating off countless German attacks. Soviet snipers like Vasily Zaitsev turned the rubble into a deadly maze, where German soldiers died before they knew they were targeted. By November, German forces controlled 90% of the city, but they had bled themselves white in the process. Stalin and his generals, Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, had been planning their counteroffensive, Operation Uranus. On November 23, 1942, Soviet forces launched simultaneous attacks north and south of Stalingrad, cutting through Romanian and Italian forces protecting the German flanks. Within days, the entire Sixth Army, 250,000 men, was surrounded in a pocket the Germans called Der Kessel, the cauldron. Hitler forbade any attempt to break out, promising that the Luftwaffe would supply the trapped army by air. It was an impossible task. The surrounded forces needed 500 tons of supplies daily, but German transport aircraft could deliver barely 100 tons under the best conditions, often much less due to Soviet air attacks and winter weather. German forces outside the pocket, led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, launched Operation Winterstorm to relieve the Sixth Army, but Soviet resistance proved too strong. As winter deepened, conditions inside the cauldron became hellish. Soldiers ate horses, then dogs, then boiled leather belts. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Typhus and dysentery ravaged the ranks. On January 31, 1943, Paulus surrendered, becoming the first German field marshal ever captured. Of the 250,000 German and Axis soldiers trapped at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 would ever see home again. The Wehrmacht had lost an entire army, and with it, the initiative on the Eastern Front. Simultaneously, in the western desert of Egypt, another German army was meeting its match. General Bernard Montgomery had taken command of Britain's Eighth Army in August 1942, inheriting forces demoralized by months of retreat. Montgomery was everything Rommel was not. Methodical, where the Desert Fox was daring, cautious, where Rommel was brilliant, but utterly determined to win through superior preparation and overwhelming force. The Second Battle of El Alamein began on October 23, 1942, with a massive artillery barrage that could be heard 15 miles away. Montgomery had assembled 195,000 men, 1,029 tanks, and 750 aircraft against Rommel's 116,000 troops, 547 tanks, and 675 aircraft. More importantly, British forces were well supplied, while Rommel's Africa Corps faced critical shortages of fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment. The battle raged for 11 days. British forces, supported by troops from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India, slowly ground down German and Italian resistance. Rommel, recovering from illness in Germany, rushed back to Africa, but found his situation hopeless. On November 4, 1942, Axis forces began their retreat, a withdrawal that would continue for 1,400 miles across North Africa. Churchill would later write, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." The twin victories at Stalingrad and El Alamein marked the war's fundamental turning point. The Axis powers, which had seemed unstoppable just months earlier, were now in full retreat on two major fronts. More importantly, these battles demonstrated that German military superiority was a myth. Given adequate preparation and resources, Allied forces could defeat the Wehrmacht. The invasion of Italy and Mussolini's fall, victory in North Africa, opened new possibilities for the Western Allies. Stalin had been demanding a second front in Europe to relieve pressure on Soviet forces. While not yet ready for a direct assault on German-occupied France, Allied leaders decided to invade Italy, what Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. The campaign began with Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, on July 10, 1943. British and American forces, commanded by Montgomery and General George Patton respectively, landed on the island's southern coast with 160,000 troops in the largest amphibious operation yet attempted. German resistance was fierce but limited. Most Italian troops surrendered quickly, their morale shattered by years of defeats. The real opposition came from two German divisions that conducted a masterful fighting retreat across Sicily's mountainous terrain. More significant than the military campaign were its political consequences. On July 25, 1943, Benito Mussolini was dismissed by King Victor Emmanuel III and arrested by his own Grand Council. Il Duce, who had ruled Italy for over 20 years, fell from power overnight. Marshal Pietro Badoglio formed a new government and began secret negotiations with the Allies. On September 8, 1943, Italy announced its surrender and changed sides, joining the war against Germany. Hitler had anticipated Italian betrayal and was ready. Operation Axis saw German forces quickly disarm Italian troops and take control of key strategic positions throughout Italy. The Germans rescued Mussolini in a daring commando raid and established him as head of a puppet state in northern Italy. The Allied invasion of mainland Italy began on September 9, 1943, with landings at Salerno, south of Naples. German resistance was immediate and savage. The landing force came close to being thrown back into the sea before naval gunfire, and air support stabilized the beachhead. What Allied planners had hoped would be a rapid advance to Rome became a grinding campaign through some of Europe's most defensible terrain. German forces, commanded by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, transformed every ridge, every river valley, every mountain pass into a fortress. The Gothic line, anchored on Monte Cassino, held up Allied advances for months. The ancient monastery atop the mountain provided perfect observation over the valley below. After repeated unsuccessful assaults, Allied commanders made the controversial decision to bomb the historic building, reducing it to rubble in February 1944. Ironically, the destruction made German defense easier. The rubble provided better defensive positions than the intact building had. It would take 4 separate battles and enormous casualties before Polish forces finally captured Monte Cassino in May 1944. The Italian campaign revealed both the promise and limitations of Allied strategy. While successful in removing Italy from the war and tying down significant German forces, the advance toward Rome proved far costlier and slower than anticipated. The soft underbelly turned out to have very hard teeth. D-Day, the liberation of Western Europe, begins. By early 1944, the long-awaited Second Front was finally ready. Operation Overlord, the invasion of German-occupied France, represented the largest amphibious assault in history and the culmination of 2 years of planning. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower faced challenges that made previous operations seem simple. The invasion required precise coordination of sea, air, and land forces across the English Channel, landing 150,000 men on heavily fortified beaches defended by the vaunted Atlantic Wall. German preparations were formidable. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, transferred from North Africa to oversee coastal defenses, had transformed the Normandy coastline into a maze of obstacles, mines, and fortifications. Concrete bunkers housing powerful guns commanded every likely landing beach. Rommel's asparagus, wooden stakes designed to destroy gliders, dotted potential drop zones. The German High Command expected an invasion, but disagreed about where and when. Many believed the assault would come at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. Allied deception operations, including fictitious radio traffic and dummy installations, reinforced this belief. Weather became the critical factor. The invasion required specific conditions: low tide to expose beach obstacles, moonlight for airborne operations, and calm seas for the naval crossing. These conditions occurred only a few days each month. Bad weather in early June forced Eisenhower to postpone the invasion, but meteorologists predicted a brief break in the storms. On June 5, 1944, Eisenhower made the decision that would change history. Okay, let's go. The invasion began before dawn on June 6th, with airborne drops behind German lines. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions landed scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula, while British and Canadian airborne forces secured the eastern flank near Caen. At 6:30 a.m., the first assault waves hit the beaches. The landings unfolded differently at each of the 5 designated beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Utah Beach saw relatively light resistance, with American forces quickly moving inland. Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, assaulted by British and Canadian forces, achieved their objectives despite stiff fighting. But Omaha Beach became a charnel house. American forces faced the most prepared German positions, commanded by experienced troops who had survived the Eastern Front. The first waves were cut down by concentrated machine gun and artillery fire. Landing craft were destroyed before reaching shore. The beach became littered with bodies and burning equipment. For several hours, the Omaha landings teetered on the edge of disaster. Only the heroism of individual soldiers, fighting their way off the beach, one bunker at a time, saved the assault. Rangers scaled the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc under heavy fire to destroy German guns that, ironically, had already been moved. By evening, Allied forces had established precarious footholds on all 5 beaches. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, but the cost was enormous, over 4,000 Allied casualties on the first day alone. German response was confused and delayed. Hitler, believing the Normandy landings were a diversion, refused to release armored reserves. When Rommel finally received permission to counterattack, Allied air superiority made daylight movement almost impossible for German forces. The breakout from Normandy would take 2 months of brutal fighting through the bocage, thick hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress. But D-Day had succeeded in its primary objective. The Second Front was finally established, and Germany now faced the nightmare of fighting a two-front war. Soviet surge. From the east to Berlin. While Allied forces established their foothold in Western Europe, Soviet armies launched their own massive offensive in the east. Operation Bagration, beginning on June 23, 1944, coordinated with the Normandy landings to stretch German forces beyond their breaking point. The Red Army of 1944 bore little resemblance to the force that had nearly collapsed in 1941. Battle-hardened, well-equipped, and superbly led, Soviet forces had learned to coordinate infantry, armor, artillery, and air power with devastating effectiveness. Operation Bagration targeted Army Group Center, the German force that had come closest to capturing Moscow. In just 5 weeks, Soviet forces advanced 280 miles, liberated all of Belarus, and destroyed an entire German army group. 28 divisions, totaling 350,000 men. The offensive opened with a massive artillery barrage, followed by coordinated attacks along a 300-mile front. German forces, weakened by transfers to defend against the Normandy invasion, crumbled under the assault. Entire divisions simply vanished, their remnants streaming westward in disorganized retreat. Soviet tactics had evolved dramatically since the war's early disasters. Deep battle operations penetrated German lines, then encircled and destroyed isolated units. Tank armies, supported by mechanized infantry and close air support, exploited breakthroughs with lightning speed that would have impressed Heinz Guderian himself. The liberation of Eastern Europe revealed the full horror of Nazi occupation. Soviet forces discovered the remnants of the Warsaw Ghetto, evidence of mass murders, and the systematic destruction of Slavic culture. These discoveries hardened Soviet determination to exact revenge on German soil. The Warsaw Uprising of August 1944 demonstrated both the heroism and tragedy of liberation. As Soviet forces approached the Polish capital, the Polish Home Army launched a premature uprising, expecting Soviet support. Instead, Stalin deliberately halted his forces, allowing the Germans to crush the uprising and destroy potential opposition to post-war Soviet control. For 63 days, 40,000 Polish fighters battled German forces in the ruins of their city. Despite incredible courage and ingenuity, including weapons manufactured in underground workshops, the uprising failed. By October, 200,000 Polish civilians were dead, and Warsaw lay in ruins. The cynical abandonment of Warsaw revealed Stalin's post-war intentions and the beginning of tensions between Soviet and Western allies. But nothing could stop the Red Army's westward advance. By December 1944, Soviet forces had liberated the Baltic states, much of Poland, and were approaching the German border. The character of the Eastern Front was changing as well. What had begun as a war of conquest had become a war of extermination. German civilians fled westward in massive refugee columns, knowing that Soviet revenge would be terrible. The Red Army's advance left a trail of devastation. Cities burned, populations displaced, and entire regions transformed. As 1944 ended, Germany faced its darkest hour. Allied forces pressed from west and east. The Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of fuel, and German cities burned under round-the-clock bombing. The 1,000-year Reich that Hitler had promised was crumbling after just 12 years. The period from Stalingrad to the liberation of Paris marked the decisive turning of World War II's tide. The Axis powers, which had once seemed destined to reshape the world, were now fighting desperately for survival. The battles we've examined, Stalingrad, El Alamein, the Italian campaign, D-Day, and the Soviet surge, demonstrated that Allied victory was no longer a matter of if, but when. Superior industrial production, growing military expertise, and the moral authority of fighting against tyranny had given the Allies advantages that German tactical brilliance could no longer overcome. But the war's end was still months away. and those final months would witness some of history's most desperate fighting. In our next episode, we'll examine the final collapse, Hitler's last gamble in the Battle of the Bulge, the liberation of the concentration camps, the race to Berlin, and the atomic bombs that ended the Pacific War. The tide had turned, but the final victory would exact a terrible price from victors and vanquished alike. Thank you for joining me for this exploration of history's turning point. Please like, subscribe, and share this video with others interested in understanding how the forces of freedom began their final march toward victory. Your comments and questions continue to shape these episodes and help us remember the lessons of humanity's greatest struggle.